I pulled up to the gate of Cruz Apple Orchard on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, and the first thing I noticed was that the sign was hand-painted. Not in a charming way, just old. The letters had faded to the point where Cruz was barely there, and someone had touched up the apple orchard part in a slightly different shade of white. So the whole thing looked like it had two different opinions about itself. I sat in my truck for a second with the engine running and looked at it. The pay was 3 times the seasonal rate. That's the only reason I was there. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I'd done orchard work before, 2 seasons in Traverse City, 1 down near Hart, and the going rate for a harvest hand was around 16, maybe 17 an hour if the operation was decent. Cruz Apple Orchard was offering 48. The listing on the county ag board had been up for 2 weeks with no takers, which I figured meant either the work was brutal or the owner was impossible to deal with. I dealt with both. Kelsey's legal fees were sitting at just over $11,000, and I didn't have a better option on the table. I got out of the truck. The gate was a heavy iron thing, painted black at some point, now more rust than paint. It was standing open. Past it, a gravel road ran straight through the first rows of apple trees, and the trees were dense and old, the kind that have been pruned so many times they start growing sideways. The apples were Honeycrisp, mostly. I could tell from 30 feet away. Big, red-green, hanging heavy. Good crop. I remember thinking that, at least. Whatever else this place was, it had a good crop.
You Bush?
I turned around. He'd come from the side of the gate, not from down the road, which I hadn't expected. Bo Cruz was a big man, 6'2", easy, heavy-set, with gray hair swept back from a wide, ruddy face. He had the kind of hands you get from 40 years of physical work. He was wearing a canvas jacket and mud-caked boots, and he was looking at me the way people look at a car they're thinking about buying. Not unfriendly, just assessing.
Yeah,
I said.
Jaden.
He nodded once, didn't offer his hand. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a laminated card, the kind you'd get from a school supply store, the self-adhesive laminate pouches, and held it out to me.
Read that before sundown,
he said.
all of it. That's a condition.
I took it.
Okay, not a suggestion.
Got it. He looked at me for another second, then turned and walked back toward the main barn without explaining anything else. That was the whole conversation. I stood at the gate holding the card. It was about the size of an index card, maybe a little bigger. The text was typed in a small font, centered, and it listed 5 rules. I read them right there. Rule 1. Any bruised fruit found during sorting had to be buried in the designated plot by midnight of the same day. Rule 2. No whistling in the rows once the fog came in. Rule 3. Any ladder found moved from where it had been left the night before was to be left alone until after dawn. Don't touch it. Don't move it back. Rule 4. Never look into the hollow of the central tree, referred to on the card as the mother tree. Rule 5. The final pressing of the season required a soil-marked witness present. I read through it twice. Then I stood there a minute. The bruised fruit thing was the only one that made any practical sense to me. Rotting fruit draws pests, spreads disease through a bin, ruins a whole crate if you're not careful. Burying it by midnight was a little specific, but I could see the logic. The rest of it I filed under old family land superstition and left it there. Every old orchard I'd ever worked had something like this. One place in Leelanau County had a rule about never stacking crates in the northeast corner of the barn because the owner's father had once slipped there and broken his wrist. People hold on to things. I tucked the card into my shirt pocket and went to find out where I was sleeping. The first few days were exactly what orchard work looks like from the outside, which is to say, they were hard and boring in equal measure. I was hauling Honeycrisp crates from the picking lines to the packing barn, loading them onto pallets, wrapping the pallets, and staging them near the loading dock where a Meyer distribution truck came every other morning. The crates were 40 pounds empty and close to 80 full. I did that for 8 to 10 hours a day. My back knew about it by the second evening. The orchard itself was quiet. There were 2 other hands working that week. A guy named Dale, who mostly ran the picking crew and didn't talk much, and a younger woman I only saw at the start and end of shifts. I didn't learn her name right away. Bow crews checked in twice a day, morning and late afternoon, looked at the staging numbers, made a note in a small spiral notebook, and left. His wife Ella ran the sorting table. She was wiry and sharp-faced, with steel gray hair pulled back tight, and she worked fast and didn't make conversation. That was fine with me. I memorized the card. Not because I was worried, just because it was short and I kept looking at it. By the 3rd day, I had all 5 rules in my head without trying. The fog started coming in on the 4th morning. Manistee fog is a specific thing. It rolls off the lake and sits low and thick and doesn't burn off until almost noon. The orchard got quiet in a different way when it was in. Not peaceful, just muffled. I noticed I'd stopped humming to myself while I worked, which I usually do without thinking. I didn't whistle anyway, so Rule 2 wasn't a problem, but I noticed the fog changed something about the feel of the rows. I kept my eyes on the crates. On the 5th day, I was pulling a sorting shift because Dale needed the other hand on the picking line. Sorting is detail work. You're moving apples from a bulk bin into premium and standard grades, checking for bruising, cuts, size. You get into a rhythm, your hands get cold and your back stays bent, and you stop really looking at individual apples after the first hour, because you're just feeling for problems. I was most of the way through a premium bin when my fingers found something wrong. Hard, small. Not the give of apple flesh, not a pit. Honeycrisps don't have pits that size or shape. I pulled it out and looked at it. It was a molar. Human, I was pretty sure. Intact root and all, a little yellowed, with a dark line along one edge that might have been an old filling. It had been sitting deep in the flesh of a large apple, not on the surface, not resting in the bin. Inside the apple itself, like it had grown there. I held it in my palm for a second. The sorting barn smelled like cold apples and sawdust. A radio somewhere was playing something I didn't recognize. Outside, the fog was still sitting on the rows. I looked at the molar. I looked at the apple it had come out of. That was it. That was the moment the ordinary version of this job ended. I closed my hand around it and went to find Ella. Ella was in the packing area near the back of the barn, going through invoices at a folding table. She had a pen in one hand and a cup of coffee that had probably been cold for an hour. I walked up and just held out my palm. She looked at it. I didn't say anything at first. I figured the object would do the talking. She set down her pen, looked at the molar sitting in the center of my hand, looked at it for maybe 4 seconds, which is longer than you'd expect someone to look at something like that if they had a normal reaction to it. She didn't flinch, didn't ask where I found it, didn't ask anything. Ella, I said, it was inside one of the Honeycrisps, not on the surface. Inside. She picked up her pen again. That was it. That was her whole response. She just picked up the pen and turned back to the invoices. I stood there for a second. I'm not great at confrontation, but I'm also not great at walking away from something that obvious. I think this is a tooth, I said. A human tooth. I heard you, she said. She didn't look up. I didn't know what to do with that. I closed my hand around the molar and kind of just stood there while she made a note on one of the invoices. The sorting barn hummed around us. The radio was still going, something with a lot of guitar. Outside the big side door, I could see the fog had come in thick off the lake, the way it does in early October in Manistee, the kind that sits low and flat between the rows and doesn't burn off until almost noon. Then Ella put down her pen, stood up, and walked past me toward the side door. And she started whistling, low and slow, a little melodic, not quite a real song, just a pattern of notes that repeated. She walked out into the fog and into the rose and kept whistling. I followed her to the doorway. "Ella!" She didn't stop. I stood in the doorway and watched her go. She was maybe 30 feet into the rose before the fog took her. I could still hear the whistling for a little while after I couldn't see her. Then I couldn't hear it either. I looked out at the fog. I looked back at the laminated card I'd been carrying in my shirt pocket since day one, because I'm the kind of person who actually does what they're told when the person telling them seems serious. Rule 2 was right there. No whistling in the rose once the fog has settled. The fog had definitely settled. Ella Cruz had just walked into the rose whistling. I didn't know if she'd done it on purpose or if she just didn't care anymore. I'm not sure which of those was worse to think about. I went back to the sorting bin and kept working because I didn't know what else to do, and the bin wasn't going to sort itself. Bo came through around mid-afternoon. I told him what I'd found. I held out the molar and he looked at it the same way Ella had, a little too long, a little too flat. Then he took it from my hand, put it in his jacket pocket, and said the sorting equipment sometimes picked up debris from the field.
That's a tooth?
I said.
Soil's full of things,
he said, and he walked off. I thought about that for the rest of the day. Soil's full of things. Like that was a normal sentence. Like I'd shown him a weird rock. Ella didn't come back for dinner. I noticed because Bo ate alone at the folding table outside the equipment shed, which was where they usually ate together when the weather was decent. He didn't mention her. I didn't ask. I went back to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of the cot and held the molar. I'd taken it back after Bo pocketed it. Or maybe he'd given it back. I honestly don't remember the exact mechanics of that. And I looked at it under the bunkhouse light. Old filling on the back edge. Root intact. Definitely human. I put it on the windowsill and went to sleep. By morning she was gone. Not went to town gone. Not left early gone. Her boots were still by the barn door. Her coat was still on the hook inside. The coffee cup from the day before was still on the folding table, and it had rained a little overnight, so there was water pooled in it. Nobody leaves their boots. Bo was already in the equipment shed when I got up. I asked him where Ella was. He said she'd gone to visit her sister in Traverse City. I said her boots were still here. He didn't answer that. Just handed me the irrigation checklist and told me to get the pump house running before 8 because the overnight frost had probably stiffened the intake valve. I took the checklist and went. The pump house is a small concrete block building on the north edge of the property, close to where the orchard meets the tree line. It smells like rust and standing water and old motor oil. There's a single overhead bulb on a pull chain, a pressure gauge on the wall that's been reading slightly wrong for at least 30 years, judging by the tape someone put over the original markings, and a lot of iron pipe running in every direction. It's not a comfortable room. It's a functional room. I'd been in it 3 or 4 times already, and I'd never liked it much. I pulled the chain, got the light, and went over to the intake valve. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the pipes settling. Old iron does that. It pops and groans when the temperature changes, and we'd had a cold night. I kept working. Then it came again, and it wasn't settling. It was a voice. A woman's voice, coming through the pipes. Not from outside. Not from somewhere nearby that happened to carry through the walls. From inside the plumbing itself, traveling through the iron, the way sound does when the pipes are connected and something at the other end is close to the metal. I stopped moving. The voice was Ella's. I was sure of it within about 2 seconds. I'd heard her talk enough times to know the particular register of it, the way she clipped her words short. This was her voice, but wrong, stretched a little, echoing in a way that made it hard to catch individual words at first. I put my hand on the nearest pipe. Cold. I leaned closer. She was saying stop. She was saying it over and over, and in between she was saying something about the pressing. Stop the pressing. Or, please stop. The echo made it hard to be sure, but it was her, And she was begging, and she was somewhere inside the pipe system of this orchard, and that was not a thing that had a good explanation. I stood there with my hand on the iron pipe and listened to Ella Cruz's voice bounce through the metal, and I tried to think of a single normal reason for what I was hearing. I couldn't come up with one. Bo had told me she was in Traverse City. Her boots were by the barn door, and her voice was in the pipes. I started following the sound. The sound was coming from the floor, not from the walls like I'd thought, not from the main line running toward the pump. The floor. I figured out pretty quick that following the pipes themselves wasn't getting me anywhere. They just looped back toward the main junction and the sound scattered. But when I crouched down and put my ear closer to the ground, it got clearer. Still echoing, still wrong in that stretched out way, but clearer. Ella's voice, coming up through the boards. I started moving crates. There were maybe 8 of them stacked against the far wall, the heavy wooden shipping kind with Cruz Orchard, Honeycrisp, Grade A stenciled on the side in black. Each one probably 50-60 pounds. I moved them one at a time and shoved them out of the way and didn't think too hard about whether this was a good idea. It was something to do that wasn't just standing there listening to a woman beg through a pipe system, so I did it. The third crate from the bottom scraped weird when I pulled it. Not the weight, the sound. Like it was catching on something in the floor. I got it clear and looked down, and there it was. A seam in the boards that didn't match the rest of the floor. A rectangle, maybe 3 feet by 4, with a short length of knotted rope looped through a drilled hole on one end. Not a trap door with hinges you could see. Just a section of floor that lifted out. I pulled the rope. The board section came up in one piece, heavier than it looked. Underneath was a ladder, just wooden rungs nailed into the dirt walls, and a square of dark that smelled like cold clay, and something else I didn't have a name for right away. Old paper maybe, and something underneath that, something damp and metallic. I went down. The cellar was about 8 feet deep, maybe 10 feet across. A single work light on a hook, the kind with a wire cage around the bulb, was already on when I got down there, which I didn't think about until later. Dirt walls, dirt floor, a low ceiling with the pump house floorboards running across the top of it. No shelves, no stored equipment, no canned goods or spare parts, or any of the things you'd actually use a cellar for. Just a table, and on the table, a ledger. It was leather-bound, dark brown going almost black at the corners, with no title on the cover. Thick. The kind of book that's been added to over a long time. I picked it up and it had weight to it. Not just pages, but the particular density of something that's been handled a lot. Oils from a lot of different hands worked into the cover over decades. I opened it. The first entry was dated 1922. Neat handwriting, formal. The kind people used back then when they'd actually been taught penmanship. A name, Harold Voss, and a date, and the words bumper crop agreement, terms accepted, soil witnessed. Below that, a description of acreage, a description of the debt, and at the bottom, a line about settlement. The settlement line was short. It just said, first male descendant, working age, bloodline only. I turned the page. Another name, another date, 1931. Same format, same language. Bumper crop agreement. Same settlement line at the bottom. I kept going. The entries ran through the 30s, 40s, 50s, different names, different acreages, different debt amounts. Some were local. I recognized a couple of the family names from the county, the kind of names you see on rural mailboxes and old church directories. Some weren't from around here at all. All of them had come to Cruz Orchard. All of them had signed. All of them had the same settlement clause at the bottom, worded slightly differently each time, but meaning the same thing. I was maybe a third of the way through the book when I started to feel the specific kind of sick that comes from understanding something before you've finished reading it. I kept turning pages anyway. The entries got closer together through the 60s and 70s. More names, more agreements. I started skimming, not because I wanted to, but because something in me was already ahead of the reading, already moving toward what I was going to find. I could feel it the way you feel a bad turn in a conversation before the other person finishes the sentence. And then I hit it. The handwriting on the page dated 1983 was familiar before I'd read a single word. I knew it the way you know a voice, not from thinking about it, just from the gut. The particular slant of the letters, the way the capital B sat heavy at the baseline, the small cramped sevens. I'd seen it on birthday cards, on the back of old photographs, on a handwritten note tucked into a toolbox that I still had in my truck because I'd never gotten around to cleaning the thing out after the funeral. Raymond Bush, my grandfather. The entry was 2 pages. I read every word of it. His farm had been failing since '79. Bad harvests, a loan he couldn't service, a second loan he'd taken to cover the first. By '83, he was 6 months from losing everything. The land, the equipment, the house his father had built. He'd heard about Cruz Orchard the way people hear about things in rural Michigan through someone who knew someone, a conversation at a grain elevator or a diner counter. He'd driven up to Manistee in September of that year, and he'd met with Bo Cruz and he'd signed. The agreement had saved his farm. The next 3 harvests were the best of his life, according to his own handwriting. He'd paid off both loans. He'd kept the land. And at the bottom of the second page, in the same cramped handwriting, was the settlement clause. In exchange for the above, I, Raymond Allen Bush, do pledge to the Cruz Orchard and its keeper, in settlement of this debt, 1 future male descendant of my direct bloodline, of working age, to be called upon at the keeper's discretion. This pledge is binding on my blood, and cannot be voided by death, ignorance, or distance. I read that line twice. Then I just stood there in the cellar with the ledger open in my hands and the work light buzzing overhead and the smell of cold clay around me. And I thought about the job listing I'd found online. The wage, 3 times standard rate, no experience required, housing included. The kind of posting that looks too good, but you apply anyway because you need the money and you figure you'll see what it actually is when you get there. I thought about how fast Bo had hired me. Didn't ask for references. Didn't ask about experience. Didn't ask for my name until I'd already given it. And when I did, he just nodded like he was confirming something he already knew. Didn't ask for my name. Didn't ask for a single thing. Because he already knew. Because I'd been on his list since before I was born. Written in by a man who needed a way out and found one and probably told himself the debt would never come due, or that someone else would figure it out, or that he'd find a way to fix it later. He hadn't fixed it. He'd died and left me a Zippo lighter and a farm that was already paid for and a debt I didn't know existed. I closed the ledger. I set it back on the table and I turned toward the ladder and I thought very clearly. I need to get out of this cellar, get to the truck, and drive south until I hit a cell signal and then call someone, anyone, and not stop driving. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It lasted about 4 seconds, because when I got to the top of the ladder and pulled myself up through the trap door and stood up in the pump house, Bo Cruz was standing in the doorway. He wasn't surprised to see me. He wasn't angry. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and he was looking at me the way you look at something that's right where you expected it to be. And he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there blocking the only way out, and the fog was thick behind him, and the orchard was quiet.
Found the book,
He said, not a question.
Found the book.
He said, not a question. Yeah, I said. That was it. That was all I had. He didn't move from the doorway, just stood there with his hands still in his jacket pockets. And I was standing in the pump house with the trapdoor still open behind my heels. And neither of us did anything for a few seconds. The fog sat behind him like a wall. I couldn't see the orchard rows at all, just Bo Cruz and gray nothing.
You know what it means,
He said, also not a question. I got the general idea. He nodded once, slow, like I'd given the right answer on a test.
Then you understand this isn't personal. Your grandfather made a choice. You're the settlement.
I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't really anything to say. He was right, technically. Raymond had signed something. Raymond had written it down in his own handwriting and put a date on it and everything. The fact that it was insane didn't change that he'd done it. Bo finally pulled his hands out of his pockets and took a step into the pump house, and I took a step back without meaning to. My heel caught the edge of the trap door, and I almost went back down into the cellar, which would have been a bad situation. But I caught myself on the wall.
The soil here,
He said, and his voice was the same flat tone he'd used every single day since I'd arrived. Like he was explaining the irrigation schedule.
isn't what you think it is. People assume it's the mineral content, the iron readings. We get asked about it sometimes. Buyers and distributors, people who want to know why the fruit comes out the way it does.
He paused.
It's not mineral.
I already knew where this was going. The ledger had been pretty clear, but him saying it out loud was something else.
Every debtor who came before you,
He said.
that's what's in the ground. That's what feeds the trees.
He said it the way you'd say, that's how the press cycle works, or that's why we start harvest at dawn. Just a fact about the operation. No different tone. No hesitation. I stood there and listened to this man explain that the orchard was fertilized with people, and he sounded like he was reading from a manual. That part got to me a little. He gestured toward the side door of the pump house, the one that opened toward the press building.
Come on then.
I went. I want to be honest about that. I went because he was bigger than me and blocking the only other exit, and I hadn't figured out a next step yet. And sometimes when you don't have a next step, you just keep moving and hope one shows up. That's not bravery. That's just not having a better option. The press building was maybe 40 feet from the pump house. We walked across the gravel in the fog, and I could hear the trees, but I couldn't see them. Just the shapes of them. And the smell out there was apples and damp soil and something underneath both of those that I'd been smelling all week without identifying. Iron. That's what it was. I know that now. He unlocked the press room with a key from his jacket. Heavy timber door, iron hardware, hinges thick as my thumb. He pushed it open and the smell hit me immediately. Iron, strong, and something fermented underneath it. And it was dark inside except for the work light on the far wall. The press was in the center of the room. I'd seen it before, briefly, the first day when Bo had walked me through the operation. I hadn't looked at it long. It was old, industrial, a cast iron frame with a hydraulic ram and a collection basin underneath. The kind of equipment that's been in continuous use for decades. Everything on it was stained dark. The basin, the frame, the collection channel that ran to a drain in the floor. I'd assumed that was apple residue. Oxidized juice, tannins, that kind of thing. That's what I'd assumed.
The pressing happens at the end of the season.
Bo said from behind me.
Always has. Soil needs it before the ground freezes. Keeps the yield consistent through the next year.
He said it like he was explaining crop rotation.
You'll want to stand over there.
I was already not standing over there. I was standing just inside the door looking at the press and the stained basin and the drain in the floor and thinking very fast. The workbench was to my left. It ran the length of the wall, and it had the usual stuff on it. A torque wrench, some fittings in a coffee can, a coil of rubber hose, a few loose bolts, and a pipe wrench. A big one, maybe 24 inches, the heavy cast kind. It was just sitting there. Bo stepped inside behind me and started to pull the door closed. I grabbed the pipe wrench off the bench. I didn't hit him with it. I want to be clear about that. Not for any moral reason, just because I didn't. He was still behind the door when I grabbed it, and by the time he got the door shut and the bar dropped, I was already looking at the hinges. 3 of them, surface-mounted, old iron, screwed into the frame from the inside. The screws were big, but the wood around them was old. I heard the bar drop on the outside, a heavy thunk. Then his footsteps on the gravel, going somewhere, not hurrying. I stood in the press room alone with the smell of iron and the work light buzzing, and the press sitting there in the middle of the room. I didn't look at it again. I looked at the hinges. I put the wrench jaw around the top leaf of the first hinge, and I leaned into it. The screws held for about 3 seconds, and then the wood gave and the hinge plate pulled free from the frame. The second hinge took longer, maybe a minute, because the screws were seated better, but they came. The third one I had to work the wrench back and forth to get purchase, and my hands were sweating, and the iron smell was very strong, and I was breathing through my mouth. Third hinge came free. The door was still held by the bar on the outside, but it was only held at the latch side now. I stepped back and kicked it, low and hard, right at the latch point. It flexed. I kicked it again. On the third kick, the latch side swung out about 4 inches and caught on the bar. And on the fourth kick, the bar jumped its bracket and the door swung open and banged against the outside wall. Cold fog air came in. I walked out of the press room. I didn't run yet. I moved fast, but I walked, because I needed to think for 10 seconds, and I can't think when I'm running. I went to the tool shed first. It was unlocked, same as always. I found the tractor gas on the bottom shelf where it always was. A 5-gallon red plastic jug, mostly full by the weight of it. I grabbed it. Then I ran. I could hear Bo somewhere in the rows to my left, moving parallel to me, not rushing. He knew the orchard in the dark and the fog in a way I didn't, and I knew that, and I ran anyway toward the center because I'd had about 4 minutes alone in that press room to think. And I'd come to one conclusion. The ledger had names going back 100 years. Every one of them had ended up in that press room. Every one of them had probably tried to run for the gate, for the road, for the forest edge. None of them had made it, or the orchard wouldn't still be running. Running away wasn't going to work. I'd figured that much out. The mother tree was at the center. Rule 4 said never look into the hollow. That's the rule that had felt different from the others. Heavier. The kind of rule that exists because the thing it's protecting matters. You don't make a rule about something that doesn't have power. The gas jug banged against my leg with every stride. The fog was so thick I was navigating by the ground under my feet, the slight rise toward the center of the orchard, the way the grass changed to bare soil around the older trees. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. I could hear Bo in the rows, keeping pace. I ran harder. The tree was worse than I'd expected. I don't know what I'd been picturing. Something old and gnarled, sure. Something that looked wrong the way old things sometimes look wrong when they've been left alone too long. But this wasn't that. This was something that had been added to, over and over, for a very long time. The trunk was maybe 6 feet across at the base, and it wasn't smooth anywhere. It had these ridges running up the bark in vertical lines, close together, irregular, and the branches overhead didn't branch the way branches are supposed to. They looped back into each other. They fused. There were places where 2 limbs had grown into one, and you couldn't tell where one ended and the other started. The whole thing had a compressed look to it, like something had been folded in, pressed down, worked into the wood over decades until the wood just accepted it. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds. That was all I gave myself. The hollow was about chest height, on the side facing northeast, which I only know because I'd been navigating by the ground incline, and I had a rough sense of where north was. It was a dark opening maybe 8 inches across, ragged at the edges where the bark had curled back, and it went deep. I couldn't see the back of it. I still had the gas jug in my left hand. I set it down at my feet, careful, upright. Rule 4. Never look into the hollow of the central mother tree. I looked into the hollow of the central mother tree. Nothing happened. It was just dark in there. Smelled like wet soil and something underneath that I don't have a word for. Something between copper and something that's been kept sealed for too long. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. The fog sat thick around me, and somewhere behind me in the rows I could hear Bo moving, not running, just walking, steady and unhurried, because he'd done this before and he knew how it ended. I reached in. The cold hit my hand first, before anything else. Way colder than it should have been inside a tree hollow in October, colder than the air around me. Then my fingertips hit something that wasn't wood. It was soft, wet. It gave a little when I pressed against it like the inside of a cheek. I kept pushing my hand in, and more of it was there. Not just one surface, but a lot of them, layered, and they were moving. Slow, pulling motions. The way something pulls when it's tasting. They closed around my wrist, and I felt them across my palm, between my fingers, dozens of small, wet pressures all at once. I did not pull back. I want to be clear about that. My whole body wanted to pull back. Every single part of me that had any survival instinct was screaming to yank my arm out of there and run. I didn't. I'd had the time in the press room to decide this was the move, and I decided. And I was not going to undo that decision because the thing inside the tree felt disgusting. I pushed my hand in deeper. My knuckles hit something hard. Metal. I got my fingers around it, and it was a key ring. 2 keys on a plain steel ring, and I grabbed it and I pulled. The pulling surfaces tightened. That's the only way I can describe it. They didn't grab the way fingers grab. They just increased pressure evenly, all of them at once, like something contracting. My arm didn't move for a second. I braced my left hand against the bark, and I wrenched backward, and my arm came free with a sound I'm not going to describe, and I stumbled back 2 steps and stayed on my feet. The keys were in my hand. My palm was wet, and I didn't look at it. I picked up the gas jug. The cap was a standard red plastic twist cap. I got it off in 2 turns, and I started pouring. I went around the base of the tree in a slow circle, keeping the pour steady, letting it run into the exposed roots, into the cracks in the bark near the ground, into the soil around the root line. 5 gallons goes faster than you think. I'd done maybe 3/4 of the circle when I heard Bo's voice behind me.
That won't do what you think it'll do.
I didn't stop pouring.
Jaden.
Flat, certain. The tone of a man who has watched people try things before.
The roots go down 40 feet. You'd need to flood the whole...
I finished the circle. I upended the jug over the hollow and let the rest of it run down the trunk. Then I dropped the jug. I reached into my right front pocket, and my hand closed around the Zippo. My grandfather Raymond's lighter. I'd had it since he died, which was 11 years ago now. And it had been in my pocket every single day since. Brass, worn smooth on the corners, with a small dent on the bottom left from when he'd dropped it on a concrete floor sometime before I was born. I'd refilled it probably 30 times. I knew exactly how the flint felt under my thumb. I held it for a second. I knew what I was using it for, not just to start a fire. The ledger had Raymond's handwriting in it, Raymond's name on the agreement, Raymond's bloodline pledge to settle the debt. I was using the thing he'd left me from the bloodline he'd sold to burn the thing he'd sold it to. I don't know if that matters in any practical sense. It mattered to me. Bo said something else, but I wasn't listening anymore. I flicked the flint. The flame held on the first try, which almost never happens with an old Zippo in cold air. I dropped it into the fuel pooled at the base of the tree. The sound the tree made when it went up was not a sound fire makes. Fire makes a roar, a rush, a crackling that builds. This built too, but underneath it there was a pitch that wasn't wood and wasn't air and wasn't anything I can put in a category. It was high and continuous, and it got louder as the flames climbed. The bark split in long vertical lines, and the splits opened and the fire went into them, and the sound got louder. The ground moved. Not an earthquake, Nothing that dramatic. A rolling shudder through the soil, like something very large had flinched. I felt it through the soles of my boots and up through my knees. The fog over the orchard shifted, just slightly, like a breath had moved through it. Then I heard the barn. A crack first, loud and sharp, then a sustained groan, then a collapse that I felt as much as heard. The packing barn was maybe 60 feet north of the mother tree. I'd worked in it every day for a week. The roof came down in sections, the way roofs do when the support structure fails all at once. Not a slow lean, but a sudden drop, and the sound it made when it hit was heavy and final, and then there was just the fire. I stood there for one more second. Bo didn't say anything after that. I turned and ran. The trees thinned out gradually, then all at once. One second I was pushing through brush with branches catching my arms, and then I was just standing on asphalt with the night sky open above me and headlights somewhere in the distance going the other direction. A state highway, 2 lanes, no shoulder markings, a reflector post every 100 feet or so. The kind of road that exists because you need to get from one small town to another and nobody ever thought much beyond that. I stopped. My lungs were doing their own thing for a minute. I put my hands on my knees and just breathed. The air out here was cleaner, or at least it felt that way. Still had smoke in it, but it was distant smoke. The kind that's more smell than substance. Behind me through the trees there was an orange glow. Not close. Getting smaller maybe, or maybe I just needed it to be. I straightened up, and that's when I looked at my hands. I'd noticed them earlier, back at the tree, but I hadn't really looked. There's a difference. Earlier I was still moving, still in the middle of it, and your brain does this thing where it files certain information under deal with this later, and just keeps you going. Later was now. Both palms were black, not dirty black, not ash black. Black the way something is when the color has gone all the way down into the layers of it. Even in the low light from the highway, I could see the edges where it stopped, just below the wrist on each hand, a clean-ish line like I'd dipped them. The skin texture looked normal. No blistering, no raw patches. It just looked like I was wearing gloves, except I wasn't wearing gloves. I tried to feel my left palm with my right thumb. Nothing. Pressed harder. Still nothing. Not the nothing of cold hands or the nothing of sitting on your arm wrong. Just absent. Like pressing on a table. I stood there with the truck keys in my right fist and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with that information. I didn't have a good answer. My hands didn't hurt, which was the one thing I kept coming back to. They didn't hurt at all. I wasn't sure if that was good or not. Probably not. There was a fern growing at the edge of the road right where the asphalt crumbled off into gravel and weeds. Wild fern, the scraggly kind that grows in low light. It was just sitting there being a fern, not doing anything. I reached out and touched it with 2 fingers of my right hand. It went gray in about 2 seconds. Not slowly. Fast, like watching something on fast forward. The green pulled out of it and the structure went with it, and by the time I'd pulled my hand back, there was just a little pile of ash where the fern had been. Some of it lifted in the breeze and scattered. I looked at my fingers. Still black, still numb. Still mine, apparently. Okay. I stood there for a while after that. The highway was quiet. A truck went by going south. Didn't slow down, didn't see me, or didn't care. The red of its taillights stretched out and disappeared around a curve. I thought about Raymond, my grandfather, who I'd mostly known as a quiet man who kept his hands busy and didn't talk much about the years before I was born. He'd left me the Zippo when he died. It was just in a small box with a few other things. A pocket knife, a folded piece of paper with some numbers on it that I never figured out, the lighter. I'd carried it for years. Used it maybe twice. I'm not a smoker. I just liked having it. I thought about him sitting across from Bo Cruz somewhere, probably at a table, probably with some kind of paperwork in front of him. I thought about how desperate you have to be to sign something like that. To write a name into an agreement knowing the name doesn't exist yet. Knowing it'll be someone you love, probably, because that's how bloodlines work. I don't know if he thought about it much after. I don't know if he carried it around for 40 years, or if he filed it somewhere in his head under, "That was a bad time and it's over now." I never got to ask him. I was 22 when he died, and the conversation I'd have wanted to have with him about this particular topic was not one I'd have known to start. He probably thought it would never come due. People do that. They make the worst deal available to them, and then they just hope the bill never arrives. Sometimes it doesn't. His didn't. Not for him. It arrived for me instead, which was the whole point, which he must have understood when he signed it. I'm not angry at him. I've thought about this, and I'm genuinely not. He was drowning. He grabbed the rope someone threw him, and he didn't read the fine print, or he read it and didn't believe it. Either way, he was my grandfather, and he taught me how to drive a tractor and how to check oil and how to tell when a storm was coming by, the way the light changed in the afternoon. And none of that is canceled out by the thing he signed in a desperate moment before I was born. But I do think about it. I'll probably think about it for a while. The glow through the trees was definitely smaller now, or the trees were just blocking more of it. Hard to say. I started walking south because south felt right. The truck was back at the orchard and I wasn't going back for it. The keys were in my hand out of habit, or maybe just because I'd been holding them and hadn't thought to put them down. I looked at them for a second and then set them on the reflector post at the next 100-foot marker. Somebody might find them. Probably not. Didn't matter. My boots were loud on the asphalt. That was the main sound for a while. My boots and the distant fire and whatever was moving around in the tree line, which was probably just deer, and I chose to believe that. I thought about Ella. I thought about her voice in the pipes, that particular quality of it, the way it echoed through the metal like it had been traveling a long distance to get there. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know if she's in the orchard somewhere, or if she's somewhere else, or if the fire changed anything for her. I hope it did. I don't have a better answer than that. I thought about Kelsey. She didn't know any of this. She knew I'd taken a seasonal job in Manistee and that I'd call when I could. And the last time I'd called, I'd told her the pay was good and the apples were Honeycrisp and the weather had been decent. She had no framework for the rest of it. I wasn't sure I was going to give her one. I'd have to think about that. What I'd tell her was that there'd been a fire, that the barn collapsed, that I got out and I was walking to the nearest town and I'd call her when I got there. That was all true. That covered it, technically. My hands swung at my sides as I walked, black against the dark. I kept looking at them and then looking away and then looking back, the way you do with something you're still adjusting to. There was a word for what they were now. I didn't have the word yet. I figured I'd find it eventually, or I wouldn't, and either way, I'd figure out how to live with it. The debt was done. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Whatever Raymond had written me into 40 years ago, it was done. The lighter had seen to that. The same blood that made the promise ending it, which felt like the kind of logic that only works in places like the orchard, and I was glad it had worked here. I was out. That was it. Just walking on a highway in northern Michigan at whatever time it was, probably past midnight, with smoke in my hair and black hands and no ride. And I was out. A light appeared ahead, maybe a mile down the road. A gas station sign, the tall kind, lit orange and white, a Sunoco. I could see the two colors even from here. I kept walking toward it.